we could all live life in some ways with hindsight. It's 2020 and you see so much more clearly. You know how you could have made better decisions, better choices. The difficulty is with foresight. How do you know going forward how to be wise, how to make good decisions? One of the concepts that I've developed to my patients, because I also still have a psychotherapy practice, with this concept of alignment with what is truer, what is really ultimately more beneficial. I call it the inner GPS.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Reflections on Living Well podcast, where we explore perspectives on the good life in the 21st century. I am your host, Broderick Rodell. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Reflections on Living Well podcast. Today, our guest is Howard Eisenberg. Howard is a medical doctor with postgraduate training in both psychology and psychiatry. He has been a lecturer at the University of Toronto and an associate professor of medicine at the University of Vermont. He is also the CEO of the international consultancy Syntrek Inc. On a more personal level, he's been on a passionate lifelong quest to discover the true nature of reality. He was awarded the first postgraduate degree in Canada at McGill University for his highly successful parapsychological research on telepathy. He then pioneered the instruction of parapsychology as a regular credit course at the University of Toronto. Almost half a century ago, he authored his first trailblazing book, Inner Spaces, Parapsychological Explorations of the Mind. His new book, Dream It to Do It, The Science and the Magic, is the culmination of his successful quest to learn how reality works. All right, Howard, how are you doing?
I'm good, and thank you. Welcome to a deep dive.
Deep dive. I'm like, wow, we're exploring how you've spent some time exploring how reality works and have a deep interest in the nature of reality and consciousness, and you lived a long life of exploration. I think that this is going to be an interesting conversation to peer into your mind about how all of these experiences have informed your view of what living well means or what the good life means. So I'm very excited to have this conversation with you. I know I just read that bio, but I also like to ask guests to, take a brief moment to introduce themselves and, how you feel in this moment.
Well, I feel appreciative of this opportunity to speak to you and others who will be listening and watching, because the information I'd like to share is of vital importance. And in terms of how I'm doing myself, I focus on trying to be true to what I now understand and my sense of mission to assist others. I would describe myself in a summary way, and it's hard to summarize myself for myself. I'd say I'm a long-time seeker and teacher, both in a sense of passions, the passion to learn and the passion to share and help others.
Mm.
And that's manifested in many different ways. So as you mentioned in your introduction, I'm a physician, also as a professor and other also academic positions. Teaching has been an important part of my work. This is my second book. I also have the consulting company. So, many different interests and balls in the air.
Awesome.
But primarily a seeker to understand and to share with others to help them.
Nice. I like that. I consider myself also, I guess you can call it seeker. I love to learn. I think learning and seeking knowledge and with the hope that I can gather a deeper, better understanding of reality and how to live a good life, how to live well. And speaking of which, what does living well mean to you? And then from here, we'll just have a free-flowing conversation about that.
Well, we may start to dive very quickly here. So for me to start with on the top, it means living in alignment, in a congruent way with my understandings of how reality works, what is beneficial in the broad sense of the term. And then we go into the deeper sense of what I mean by that. Most of us at this stage of our world, and on this, as I call it, level of our reality, are very caught up in our individuality as egos. And in that, we are aware of ourselves as being separate from everybody else. Everybody else is othered in some way. People who are somewhat closer to us in family or in proximity, friends, social contacts, are a little less other, but still other. It's still not us. And we're living right now at a time in the history of the world as we understand it, where there's an extreme level of distraction into the outer world. So not only are we in the ego state, which we're all pretty well caught up in, separating from each other, but we're also, from that, separating ourselves from everything else in nature and the rest of the world, be it the living world, other animals, plants, or the inanimate world, which some people believe is infused with consciousness in itself in a different way. So with my understanding now that that's illusion, that sense of separation from each other and from our environment, and with my awareness in terms of what we know currently in science and the news, that we're facing multiple existential threats right now for humanity globally. It's not a matter of just a country or a particular culture or religion, it's the world. And I'm very concerned about the critical nature of this imbalance and the small, from my understanding of it, window of time to, in a sense, save ourselves. And that's what's informing me right now. So I'm trying to help people understand, not from a moral preaching point of view, not simply from an historical point of view, saying this has been, an ancient wisdom, so we should still follow it. But in my book, I try to also show scientifically and logically, you don't have to believe in faith about some particular religion or ideology. There is a way you can learn to see and think through things to know real truth. And I tried in my book to almost make it ethnogenetic, almost psychedelic intellectually, where it's a guided experience, increasing levels of self-reflection, and then working with intention and experientially becoming aware that this, again, the sense of separation is illusion. And there's a deeper source where everything is coming from, which is sometimes called generically the source. For many people, they may have called that traditionally God. Some use more maybe philosophical terms, like I have myself at times, universal mind. So there's a number of different terms used for it. But the notion is, again, I repeat, that we're really living mostly right now in a world of extreme illusion, probably the worst ever in the history of humankind that I'm aware of. It's being greatly amplified and accelerated by IT technology, particularly the smartphone, but the internet broadly speaking as well. And now with the emergence of AI, coming back to my point where I said it's a critical window of time, we don't have time to take a leisurely, exploration and study of these different notions of what reality is. I wrote my book under a great sense of almost duress. I have a very heavy heart. I'm often feeling close to tears when I see what's happening in the world. I use the allegory of Plato's cave in the beginning of my book, where ironically I find myself in a strange situation where I feel somehow, and we can go into that more if you want, I've come to understand, again, how reality works. I've come into the light of that understanding. And I'm trying to come back into the cave where people don't have that understanding, where they're naive and in a state of fear and perhaps anger at being imprisoned and stuck in the cave. And I'm trying to help people understand that they can actually leave that sense of imprisonment and entrapment and come into the sun and connect to the greater world outside. This can sound almost fanciful and poetical, but it's deeply grounded in history of all the major historical traditions we have records of. Modern science, the leading edge of it, be it in quantum mechanics or neuroplasticity, and logically, the way it connects. And then finally, experientially, so the readers in my book, I designed it this way, can actually experience, taste some of this extended sense of reality, not just understand it or try to believe it, actually feel it, work with it.
Beautiful. So for you, living well. One important piece of living well is coming to our senses, in a sense.
In a
Realizing.
weird way, yes. I mean, because once I had this realization of our essential unitary nature at a deeper level, I didn't sort of have a sense of choice. Once I had that awareness, that understanding, that feeling, it also is a feeling of deeper connection for me to everyone else, and even, again, our so-called inanimate natural world. And it's like a moral imperative. It's not a choice to ignore and just say, well, they have to find their own way. And if things don't work out, well, things come and go. And that's just the nature of, existence, so to speak. Again, it feels like a moral imperative. It feels like a sense more of mission. I've actually self-published my book at considerable expense, given I'm in the retirement phase of life, and rushed it out, believe it or not, from first submitting a manuscript, a rough manuscript, to physically having it available all over the world. I did that in 5 months. I was told it was impossible, but then that's something else I discovered historically. There's many things that we all consider to be impossible, which are not at all impossible. And I've broken through many of those barriers, in my own life, my own career. If we could all live life in some ways with hindsight, it's 2020, and you see so much more clearly, how you could have made better decisions, better choices. The difficulty is with foresight. How do you know going forward how to be wise, how to make good decisions? One of the concepts that I've developed to help my patients, because I also still have a psychotherapy practice, with this concept of alignment with what is truer, what is really ultimately more beneficial. I call it the inner GPS. And I joke with them sometimes, and I say, just like cars and vehicles have GPSs, so do we. It's factory installed, but it's not activated, it's not turned on. And the way you activate it is by reflecting in a situation, thinking through whatever your situation is, and choosing to do or not do what subsequently makes you proud of yourself, irrespective of whether other people applaud you, agree, help, or are critical. But you're being true to yourself in that moment. You're being in the moment. You are reflecting. You're making a choice given all circumstances that you think you will not subsequently regret. It's like an inner compass, as one example of working with those deeper values.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. So, living well for you, a big piece of it, central to it, is realizing, coming to understand that we're not an isolated phenomena in the universe, but we are actually intertwined. There's an interconnectedness. There's a sameness. As Thich Nhat Hanh says, an interbeing.
Yes.
There's intersubjectivity that we all connect to, that there is a deeper aspect of ourselves that's universal. And it is important, in order for us to live well, to come to that realization and realize that, because as we're seeing all of the divisiveness and hyperpolarity in our society, and I think this is what you're saying, is that we're so captured by our self, our egoic self,
Mm-hmm.
that we've lost sight of something that's deeper and richer. Or for a lot of us, we're just we lack any awareness of it at all, that there is something beyond this small egoic self. And you're suggesting that it's really important, in order for us to live well, that we connect with a deeper, more richer aspect of ourselves. And that begins with trying to understand ourselves deeply and the nature of reality itself. Does that sum up what you were just saying?
Yes, in terms of why I feel this is a moral imperative and so important. But I would say it's not just a question optionally for people to learn how to live a deeper, more authentic, a more meaningful life. I think again it's a matter of existential survival right now. I
Mm-hmm.
think again we're at that critical juncture. Another way of looking at this, coming back to divisiveness we're experiencing right now, and my understanding at a more fundamental level of the unitary nature of everything. Many, many years ago, I read a book by the psychiatrist R.M. Buck about his spontaneous experience of what we might call now mystical experience. He wrote a book about it called Cosmic Consciousness. And in that book, among other things he described, he said he'd come to understand that love is the fundamental underlying principle of the universe. I remembered the line in the book, but it wasn't meaningful to me, and I have to admit back at the time, it's hindsight's 2020, back at the time, I didn't take it seriously. I kind of even wondered in a somewhat critical way, why would he say that? I mean, he's a psychiatrist and he's sharing other, profound insights. Why that? Like, that really is the fundamental underlying principle of the whole universe? So it didn't make sense to me on that level. I knew love was something important emotionally and for family bonds and good friendships and so on, and maybe love of country for some people. Um, but in terms of being a fundamental, existential, ontological principle, no, it didn't ring for me that way. And then I came to understand it differently when I had this realization a few years ago, just leading up to, again, my writing this book, Dream to Do It. And that was that love connects us. And some of us also feel that, loving connection with our pets, with our plants, with other aspects of the environment, with a clear sky, with stars at night, and so on. Many other ways you feel that loving, connection to something which is sort of out there, and yet it's a connection. So it's part of you in a weird way. You have that connection. And as a therapist, I've seen over the years people who have come into a relationship with each other romantically, perhaps married, perhaps started family, and did so at the time out of their own free choice. They weren't arranged marriages, they weren't pressured by any other circumstances. And yet some years later, and sometimes only a few years later, the love is gone and it turns into hatred. And in many of and probably the majority of people who end up divorcing, it starts turning into almost that hatred. You want to really take as much as you can from the other person and hurt them as much as you can. And I wondered, how can that flip? How can you feel so close and connected and caring with someone and it turns into hatred? So I was very interested in thinking again about the polarity of the two. And then in my studies over the years, and particularly again since this recent understanding, which was almost like a revelation a few years ago before the book, I came to understand the Bible in a whole different way. It was almost like it was decoded for me. And I say for me because it wasn't like I had to figure it out. And even now, quotations just keep coming to me from the Bible. As you know, my book, there's many other religious texts and historical texts I draw on, but I don't know, for some reason, a lot of this is coming up from that source. And as you may know in the Bible, it says God is love. And coming back to this notion of God, source, the unitary, and love connects. And one thing I would say for people right now in the world is like my sense of mission is to help people come to an understanding of the deeper underlying reality and the critical nature of it for our subsequent survival on this level in a coherent and a broadly beneficial, harmonious way for all. We need to understand that those people right now who are calling out with hatred and anger are not to be followed. God is love. Those who speak with love from their heart, with compassion, for the well-being of others, and are not speaking from their ego, and are not craving power, those are the ones we need to listen to. Those are the ones we need to collaborate more so. And so I would just put out again, as I say, as a cautionary note to all who may be hearing this. When you hear people speaking out of anger, out of hatred, that's an automatic red light. It's an automatic sign. They are not coming from spirit. They are not coming from authenticity. They are not coming from good. And you have a choice. We always have choices. I really appreciate Viktor Frankl's discovering when he was in hell on earth in a concentration camp with no reasonable expectation that he could ever survive. But he came to the insight that there's one thing these brutal prison guards, the concentration camp, could not control: his own imagination. And he imagined somehow he would, in the future, be out of that concentration camp, not only simply survive physically, which was itself improbable at that time in that environment, but become world celebrated for his insight and breakthrough of what he'd come to understand and enable him to survive. And one quotation in particular I love, and it's between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our freedom to choose.
Mm-hmm.
We always have choices, always, without exception. They're not always so obvious. They're not always necessarily easy ones, but we always have choices. Mm. And that's fundamental, because where your focus goes, energy flows. It can change your reality and the reality essentially for everyone else when you understand this.
Mm-hmm. Nice, really nice. So I love that love is so foundational and important, because my guiding principle is love. That's why it's that in the way you express that, you describe that for you, and how love connects. And the reason why for me love is my primary value is for that reason. It's because when we fall in love, when we, not just romantically, but love in general, that love is all about connection. It's all about realizing it takes away the distinction in the feeling, in the moment. There's no longer a distinction between the loved and the beloved, and the lover and the beloved. And I think that it's such an important value for realizing what you're saying and actually living it in the world. I think that love is the way that we express that unitary consciousness that you're speaking of, that universal consciousness, or how we express God in the world. Isn't it in the Christian tradition they talk about, the church, or God is present in the space in between uh, people who are gathered in His name, and the idea is that in the name of love, that space in between, when we kind of let go of our egoic selves for a moment and allow ourselves to really connect with another, we're in that space of love. And from that space, we can, illuminate more love in the world. We can illuminate more goodness in the world. Those things are such an important piece of the puzzle. You also, go ahead, you want to say something else?
I was going to say, it's also reinforced, again, as it's scientifically. So my book includes, obviously, again, philosophy and logical connection between different sources of information, and also the experiential aspect. But it's more, fundamental at a deeper level to understand that we're what I call amphibious beings. So, as I said, we're caught up right now to an extreme in distraction and experiencing everything else as otherness, where there's a lack of connection, whether there's, emotional of love or hate in the equation at all, but just that basic sense of identity. And as I said, I think we're amphibious beings. So amphibians are things like frogs and salamanders, which can live in two different dimensions, in water and on land. And I use that term symbolically because I believe we are amphibious beings. We can live on this level where we seem to be separate, but again, fundamentally are not, but we seem to be. And nature and physical objects around us and so on. But there's this other level which we can all learn to access. It's not a matter of just believing it, where you experience the unitary nature of everything, of all. And coming back to how can we work with this in practical terms, and my background too as a psychotherapist, when we first fall in love, most of us spend a lot more time intentionally looking into each other's eyes, into the eyes of the beloved. And that could also be, a romantic partner, be a child, it may be a pet.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we do it with our dogs and so on. And feeling again that, that sense of connection. When, going back to the romantic example, and how so many relationships unfortunately deteriorate, not just losing the love, but turning into the opposite, anger and hatred. When people get familiar with the relationship and get more distracted by other things and other people, they don't spend as much time intentionally looking into each other's eyes. So if you're living together, for example, and one person's washing dishes and the other person over in the refrigerator talking to each other, you know each other, you're in the same space physically, but you're no longer looking in each other's eyes. And also, words help us communicate to a degree,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not the whole thing. Sometimes, we have expressions say, the map's not the territory. It's a pointer. It's not the whole thing. So even if we go back in couples who feel, strain in their relationship, be it again romantically or with children or other relatives, and if we try intentionally to look more into their eyes and with soft eyes, not a hard stare to sort of, competitively stare someone down, but an open stare of openness, of connection, of invitation, like a bridge. It's beyond words. It connects us. And right now, because we're also, so many of us working virtually, and even when we're out and about, glued to these screens, we're losing the eye contact with each other. Working on the internet, as I do now, as you are as well, with, video, on the one hand, technologically, it's a wonderful achievement, and it's helpful. I certainly value it for what it can do. But people don't realize what it can't do. So, for example, when you're in a video call, webinar, whatever it might be, which is interactive, and you're looking at someone in the eyes, as we are right now to a degree, you're not really looking in the eyes. You'd have to look at the camera for your eyes to make direct contact, and then you wouldn't see the other person's face on your screen, quite as well. And then the synchronization between our facial expressions and, what we're saying, what we're articulating is not perfect. And then the visual resolution for fine expressions, again, is not so, apparent on screens, no matter how good our computers might be. But most people don't understand what they're losing in that. Similarly, I find many people these days are relying on texting as a way of communicating. And what I find interesting sometimes watching people, when they're going back and forth, it's like it's a live interchange. It's not just they've sent the message in 24 hours, someone's going to pick it up and reply to it. And I'm thinking to myself, you're using a phone and you're texting and you're having interactive text like every few moments, message going back and forth. Why don't you just make the call? And a lot of people are losing the awareness, the consciousness of the richer connection when we also connect with the voice in real time. So there's many ways, again, to work with this understanding of the deeper reality and bring it into this amphibious, level of our existence in a way that's very meaningful and beneficial. I think that the ideal is for this level of reality, and I repeat, it's a level. Charles Tart calls it consensual reality. I think there's a purpose in it, which we can go into an even deeper dive as to what that purpose is. But I also think, related to that purpose, there's a value and a certain level of importance for this level to be more harmonious and sustainable, which it is not neither right now. So paying in part a higher level of attentiveness to this level of reality does not mean you can't participate in it. As I said, we're amphibious beings, but it'd be more balanced. It would be more harmonious. It would be more like, something you would, if you were watching a show on TV or however you might on some device, it would be something more you want to experience rather than that you simply have to experience. And for many of us, life on this level right now is scary, it's difficult, it's unfair, and very tenuous in terms of how much time we have left.
I am so glad that you mentioned all of those. You said a lot there, but I want to try to sum up some of those
Thank you.
things. You're welcome. I really appreciate that you brought up this idea of the value of modern technology, internet technology, information technology. We're having this conversation via this
Mm-hmm.
technology, it's video, and there's something that's beautiful that's happening in that space.
Mm-hmm.
Nonetheless, I am in 100% agreement with you that we can take advantage of it, and I surely appreciate it because I spend a lot of time in this space. I learn a lot through this technology, these various information technologies, and I'm not going to, throw them away and not use them. Yet, I do see that there's a shadow and a darker side to it. And that shadow is, yes, you're right. We're having this conversation, but there's a lot missing. When you're in the same space with another individual, a lot of our senses, much more than the five senses that we typically think of, are activated,
Yeah.
much more activated when you in the same space with another individual. And I think sometimes that we're thinking that we're connecting. We are connecting,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that I hope that we don't lose sight of that there's a deeper and richer connection there. Because what happens is, like you're saying with texting, it's such a good
Mm-hmm.
metaphor, not metaphor,
Mm-hmm.
but example
Mm-hmm.
of how we text a lot and we're like, okay, I'm texting. And I know I do it myself. I'm like, well, I can text so I don't have to call and engage. That's very interesting. And I don't have to fully engage. And here I am, my primary value is love and connection. Yet I'm willing to use this technology. And when it first came out, I was like, I'm not texting. I'm not going to do that because of the things that you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, no, I'm not going to do it. And then I got into doing it, and I can maintain my distance. I can be quote unquote connected at a distance, and I think that that is contributing to problems in society, mental health issues, because we think that we can be connected while pushing ourselves further and further and further away from others. I'm not going to call you. Even that's a distance already in and of itself. I am going to get further away from you and distance myself even further and text you. And a lot of times, what you see, as you see on social media, which I really don't use, but you see and stuff from what I hear, I read enough
Mm-hmm.
news to see this. So Facebook and I guess X now, formerly Twitter,
Mm-hmm.
people are not their real selves. They are a caricature of themselves. I think we're already that anyway. We already have masks on, and then we've
Mm-hmm.
deepening our mask. We're deepening the character of ourselves, and we're putting out all of this toxic stuff, this divisive stuff, because we've gotten further and further into our distinctions. We've gotten further and further away from each other, and that only creates a furthering our the problems and issues that comes with that, such as hatred and violence and destruction of the environment. And one of the reasons why we can destroy the environment the way that we're doing it because we keep pulling ourselves further and further and further away from organic nature, and conceal ourselves further and further away from it. And we see the implications of that in the end and how we're harming the environment. That's ultimately
Mm-hmm.
going to harm ourselves. But
That's
it's
right.
analogous to the same things that we're doing with technology. We further and further remove ourselves away from each other. And we have this historically, we know this. We as human beings have a tendency towards violence. And we can do a lot of harm to each other when we
Mm-hmm.
feel completely disconnected from the other.
That's right.
And we're
That's right.
further and further doing that. We continue to do that. That's only going to create more and more problems. That's not going to contribute to a good life, I don't think.
Unfortunately, you're correct. And two other points to make here. This technology, the interactive technology we have right now with phones and internet, it's addictive. It is
Mm-hmm.
highly addictive.
Oh
I
yeah.
speak as a physician, as a medical doctor. We already know in terms of people, have some sense of nothing, the dopamine and have the dopamine hits, as they call it, and so on. It is addictive. It's designed to be addictive.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an accident. And now we're moving at an extremely rapid pace into the world of AI. So talk about this connection and lack of authenticity. So now you can have, as you know, a bot representing yourself, interacting with other people. You can change the appearance of your face, make it more handsome, prettier if you want to. You could modify your voice, or you can just make a clone of your voice, and that could be used for other purposes as well. And then you don't even know if you're really talking to a real person whatsoever, not just if you're doing through technology as we are, but is it even a real person, or is it just a very well-programmed AI script that you're interacting with? And we're going more and more at a very fast pace into that. And it's a weird thing because it's almost like we as spiritual, if you like, even just on a more common level, emotional beings, have been able to create these machines, these computers. And although we were the creators of them, so to speak, and we initially created them to help us in certain ways, just like the old calculating machines and calculators, as you remember, things of that nature, just to help us, we're starting to change our whole culture to become much more machine-like, computer-like. So even when you call companies these days, in many cases, you don't get a live person, you get a voicemail prompt. And then you get a number of options that you could use. It doesn't necessarily lead to a live person even then. And sometimes you may quickly find what you want, but very often you do not. And it's, just going in a loop and getting very frustrated. And many companies have an announcement when are calling them. We have a temporary, excess of people on wait. We apologize. There's no truth in that. I mean, they're designing it that way. And I know as a corporate consultant, many, many companies for a few decades now are becoming leaner and meaner, downsizing, trying again to maximize the return to shareholders. Again, exploitation.
Yep, we completely, yeah, and the amount of suffering, unnecessary suffering that we're seeing in the world is a reflective of all of this.
Very much so.
We're furthering and furthering our distinctions, our isolation from each other. And again, technology, there are benefits, but there are costs. We have to weigh out the benefit costs.
Yes.
And do a benefit cost analysis. I think technology is going to keep going forward. But also, what I feel like that's not happening. And I think you agree with this based on me reading your book. Or I like it reading with your book or sitting with your book. I think that's the right way to say it.
Right, that's nice.
Having that conversation with your text. That I think a lot of it is rooted in and I've said this quite a few times here on this podcast, is the way we see the world. We see the world as materialistic. And if you see the world as materialistic, you see yourself as just the brain, neurons firing. I think it's crazy, magical thinking that people even get away with saying that. But at any rate, and if you think that that's who you are, then you are not. You're disconnecting from something that's deeper and richer. Now, I don't care what kind of language you use to describe that thing, but you at least can use some kind of language to point to it. When you deny that existence, because you're running away from religious institutions that were problematic in the Dark Ages or whatever, you're still running away from that like a child, like a little teenager who's trying to run away from their parents in an abusive relationship with their parents. There's something to trying to get out of that abusive relationship. But if you're maintaining your teenager mentality, and I think that a lot of so-called thought leaders in the world today still have a teenager mentality based on this metaphor, and we're refusing to expand and develop our consciousness beyond a narrow view of ourselves. So for me, it's not surprising that you see the type of things that we're seeing in the world, because we completely are not, we, all of us, of course not, but a lot of us are devoted to running away and really refining our capacity to distance ourselves from and toxic relationships that we've had in the past. And I think that those toxic relationships were embedded in certain institutions, be they religious
Mm-hmm.
institutions or social institutions, that was harmful in our past that we're running further and further away from. But we're only developing our capacity to distance ourselves versus developing our capacity for connection. We're not looking at what was good about, say, for instance, religious
Mm-hmm.
institutions of the past. What was good about
Yeah.
them? I mean, they still exist, but the way that they were done back then. What was good about it? What was beneficial about it? What were the mystics in those traditions saying? No, everything wasn't awful about those different things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in in order for us to, as you say, live well and be connected to this universal self, we need to reevaluate the way that we're seeing the world, as you articulate
Yeah.
clearly in your text. We have to, in order to connect with each other, to experience more love, to experience more social connection, we have to reevaluate our foundational assumptions about how we are oriented in reality, in the universe. And now, of course, there's various ideas out there. I'm not going to say we can have a long. This can be a different podcast having not a debate, but a discussion about metaphysics.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think that we at least need to give some attention to that, because I think the signs are indicative of an excessive amount of distance from our more universal self. We've gotten so caught up into, as the Buddha said, the relative reality, and have lost touch with the quote unquote absolute or more universal aspect of reality. And I think to live a better life, to live well, is to move further and further into our more universal selves, and see what happens, and see what's that's going to look. I have my ideas about what that could look like, but at least we can at least move in that direction.
To quote the Bible again, without vision, the people perish.
Yeah.
Without this deeper understanding, humanity as we know it will perish, and in a very short time. That's why I say it's a very small window of opportunity.
Yeah.
And the ideal, I repeat, as I understand it, is not for us all to sort of condense ourselves into this one unitary source, consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
but to have that balance as amphibious beings where we live harmoniously in two different dimensions for the enrichment of both,
Yep.
for the benefit of
Exactly.
all.
Exactly. And I guess I asked you this question before I even said. So, speaking of all of these different things, these ideas, what does that look like in the world? What does the world look like when we are? You kind of hinted at some of these already. Um, Connected with each other. And so, what the question is that I'm asking is, so the good life is, or living well. Uh, there needs to be a realization of our interconnectedness and how we're
Mm-hmm.
intertwined. Our sameness, I like to say. There's some sameness that we have
Mm-hmm.
with each other. What does that look like in the world?
Well, again, if you like, not only from this source, but for the Bible for some people, it's known as the Golden Rule. If you just took the two things I've mentioned, earlier as well about the eye contact, intentional eye contact, softly, not hard eyes, not aggressively, and be guided by the Golden Rule to treat others as you would desire, as you would have them treat you. Just those two things alone could be transformational quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Just those two.
Yeah.
There's more, but just those two as immediate, takeaways to
Mm-hmm.
implement
Yeah.
and
So
clearly
those.
see the value.
Yeah. So those are some too. So what would that do if we start to look at each other softly? I think you've already hinted at it, but I just want the audience to hear a little bit more. If we look at each other softly and if we follow the golden rule, what does that look like in the world?
Well, there's so much, and that too from the book. But again, to come back to some of the contemporary information we have, We know there is an epidemic, as strange as it may sound, of loneliness in the world right now.
Mm-hmm.
Your Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, in the United States, has written a book on the crisis of loneliness. Two governments that I'm aware of, the UK and Japan, have appointed federal ministers of loneliness because they feel it's such an important crisis. I know in my field of medical psychotherapy, we're seeing tremendous, again, consequences of people feeling that disconnection. So again, this is fairly new in our world. Before we had technology, which strangely enough seems to connect us so amazingly, we were more connected. We were closer to our families. We were closer to our extended families. We were closer to our neighbors. We were closer to the people who we needed to cooperate with to live and live, securely or reasonably well and healthfully. And again, we've lost so much of that because of being overly distracted in the outer world, and particularly the accelerator, weirdly enough, of the very technology that seems to connect us. It's almost like if this was crack heroin. It feels good. You get that jolt immediately. Wow, I can connect anywhere in the world in a moment. There's a cost. Everything has a cost. Back to the GPS. Think it out so you won't have regrets. I like the indigenous concept from the American Indian community historically of the law of 7 generations. Thinking through, as best you can try, but intentionally, what the implications, what the consequences of something you're proposing to do to change or ignore would have for 7 generations of your relatives, your ancestors, into the future. It's taking a longer view. It's taking a more comprehensive view. It's a wide-angle lens view rather than a telephoto lens view. So another problem we have right now compared to other periods of time when wisdom was more prevalent is we're very short-term in our focus. We just look immediately, what can we do, what can we get away with? And we don't think about the larger consequences. We have a huge problem right now with chemical pollution all over the world, even plastics, microplastics. There's nowhere in the physical world we're aware of right now, and that includes the polar environments, which are free of microplastics. And they're in all of our bodies right now, and we have no idea how we can remove them. I could go on, and it's a deep, dark list, but there's so many external, objective, irrefutable examples of how we are in such a deteriorated state and how fragile, again, our window is to be able to still sustain our life much longer.
What would it look like if we didn't, if we were in a, I guess what I'm asking is, I recognize all those dark places and those the shadow aspects of all of the things that we've been doing to ourselves for quite a for quite a long time now. In this modern world with this technology, what does the good life look like? What does a life well lived look like?
I think it would be a life where we still have some of the technology, but we don't use it as we do right now, even going back to example texting. It's one thing to send a message for the record to someone that doesn't require you actually interact with them. But if you need to interact or see the greater value, if you're doing it sort of big live, even if it's by phone, as opposed to in person, it would still be in your life, but to a more measured, a more balanced degree. I think we need to also go back to the small village concept, where you live in an environment where you know most of the people who live around you. It doesn't mean have the same background, but that you know them. And if you're being guided with eye contact and, again, golden rule, treating others as you would like to, it's harmonious, it's collaborative. Everybody's helping everybody else out. There's no loneliness. So I think, strange enough, and that seems like we're going backwards a bit when I talk about that concept, but I don't think we live well in our big cities at all. And most of us have more and more, become urbanized all over the world. And I don't think it suits us well at all. I think many people, too, irresponsibly, you know, have sexual relations without any thought about pregnancy and the responsibility of taking proper care of those children afterwards. I think people have to, again, be more intentional in their GPS. Think through those things more wisely. There's so many levels of this in terms of applications, but I did want to give you some examples, and I hope I have. There's applications of this. It's not just something to think about. Now we're just scratching the surface and what those applications are. I'm even in the area of medicine for healing. When you start understanding the power of your deeper mind for healing, the placebo effect, which is reasonably well known, but not in the way it could be known in terms of what it indicates to us. Some people know it's a term. It's something that doesn't have any chemical effect, but it's like a dummy medicine. And if you don't know it's a real medicine, you may actually experience some of the benefits of the real medicine, but it's all from your imagination. And they sometimes are using this concept when they test possible new drugs, the pharmaceutical companies. But what they don't teach people is, if your imagination can cure you because you think you're taking a real medicine, which is just an inert chemical placebo, imagine what your mind can do if you use your mind directly and you were trained to do so. I mean, there's so much we've missed in practical applications of this. And we have, as you know, a huge healthcare crisis. There's insufficient healthcare providers for the world. It's rather unsustainable as it is right now, and very, again, disconnected. It's not an integrative system, at all. All of these things could be changed. We need a different type of leader. I like Plato's concept of the philosopher king. Somebody who's leader, not because of personal ambition at all, which is the opposite of what we have right now. And somebody who doesn't even nominate themselves, say, like, I would consider being your leader. Someone who's chosen by the elders, by the community, for being good-hearted, for being wise, for being healthy. We need more of that. And back to the village concept, if we knew who our representatives were at our, let's say, town councils, and we had a relationship with them, it wasn't just with their administrative assistant, face to face. They were accountable to us. Again, a different type of governance, a governance for the people, by the people, in truth, not just in words.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think that's what I was getting at is by asking you those questions is, the living well, it requires us to be connected, communities. I like that idea of small communities. Even if you do live in an urban environment, can you live in your little neighborhood and be connected with people in that neighborhood? And I think that's the thing I long and miss, to be honest. I grew up in a very small rural town. You know practically, you don't know everybody, but you know most people.
Yeah.
I mean, things are spaced out in a small farm town, but you still
Yeah.
have a decent relationship with everyone. There's a certain kind of respectful interaction that you tend to have with everyone. But I think that even can be improved upon. I think that the beauty of religious institutions is that it is a community. People go there, they go to a church service once a week, for instance, in the Christian tradition. I'm sure there's other traditions out there, of course. But the one I'm most familiar with, because I grew up in it, is every Sunday going to church services. There are activities that the church community does. There are prayer meetings. There's all these different things that you're involved with the life of another human being, or a group of human beings. You're interacting, you're going through the various challenges of being in community. But I think that there's a richness there. There's something there that's important. Though now again, these various institutions are not perfect, because if they were, the church, wouldn't be membership wouldn't be dropping. But I'm not saying that you should necessarily become a member of a particular tradition that already exists. There are new traditions, new communities that are coming into existence as well. But the take-home message is that community is an important piece of living well. It's conducive to mental health. It can resolve this loneliness epidemic. And, connecting with our environment in these smaller communities. All of these things are important. And like you said, we don't have to throw away technology. We can still have technology.
But in balance.
In balance, exactly. And that's I guess I see that this is a really big, the thing keeps coming back for you. A big piece of the puzzle for you is connection, reconnecting. In that connection, we realize more of our universal selves when we are in community, in connection with other human beings and with the natural environment in general.
Yes, very much so.
I love that. And some of the things that you slipped in throughout, and we're coming nearly to a close there, but some of the things you slipped in, the importance of the imagination, and imagining a more beautiful world, the importance of intentions and also attention, where we place our
Mm-hmm.
attention.
Yes.
And then you also said something I think that's really important around leadership, and that it's not just having a leader because they're interested in the acquisition of power, but a leader that is there out of service to the whole. I know a lot of criticism towards the Republic, Plato's Republic, or what the idea of the
Mm-hmm.
philosopher kings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think as a metaphor more than anything, but I think
Mm-hmm.
that the idea you can still extract some good ideas from that, and I think that there's something to the philosopher kings. I think that there's something to this idea of you need leadership, you need people. I look at it this way, and I think maybe you
Mm-hmm.
agree with this: is that you want leaders who really tapped into that deep well of consciousness, and are interested in bringing out that. That experience, that richness from that, and recognize that it's not about me. It's about something. It's about this aspect of myself that's more
Mm-hmm.
universal. And as a leader, I want to operate in the world from that space. And is that will contribute to well-being in the society, versus a person that's like, no, it's all about Broderick.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is about Broderick, and I want to be a leader so I can,
Yeah.
for my own self interest, so I can acquire power. It's all about me. That's not going to create a good society,
No.
not at all. And that's what Plato was getting at. That's not going to create a good society when you have a bunch of selfish, greedy people
Which
trying
is
to
generally, unfortunately,
control.
how leadership is populated
I
these
know,
days.
right?
Those are the types.
Exactly. Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this has been great. Can you say a little bit? I know you mentioned briefly that you had an experience a couple years ago, but I think it's you've had a long life at work. I know we're at the end here, but I at least want to ask you this question. I love
Mm-hmm.
asking this question. How did you come to this realization or these viewpoints on what living well means to you? What were some things? I know that can be a long podcast in and of
It could
itself,
be.
but
I say that too. Hindsight's 2020, so I can connect a lot of dots in my earlier experiences.
yeah.
Which helped lead me to where I am. But there was a particular time just a few years ago when I was invited to do a keynote address for an annual conference of people who did, so to speak, laying on of hands, therapeutic touch. They would
Mm-hmm.
heal people with their own body energies in a certain way, so to speak. And to honor that invitation, I did a very deep dive into all of the parapsychological literature for almost half a century since I wrote my first book, Inner Spaces. I looked at the leading research in physics and quantum mechanics. I looked at comparative religions. I looked at the indigenous teachings worldwide. I looked at the latest findings on how the brain works, MRI scans, neuroplasticity, um, epigenetics. You've read the books, you have some idea. Again, a tremendously wide, you know, um, scope of what I was bringing into my awareness intellectually to do this presentation. And up to now, at that point, I always thought of myself as a scientist. I sort of bought into what we call the materialistic notion of reality, that everything fundamentally is composed of some material substance, atoms, atomic particles, that there really is an independent physical reality out there, and that really is, again, a separation, as I said earlier, between all of us. And so I thought that to explain some of the spiritual things and some of what we call in parapsychology psychic phenomena, like telepathy and precognition, we may have to bring in other dimensions and other types of energies and fields. But I was still in that framework that there still really is a world out there that's material and
Mm-hmm.
it's separate from us. And when I did this very deep data dump, I mean deep, but you've read the book, so you have an idea of the scope I was going into. Suddenly, one day, and it happened within just minutes, and I was not expecting this in the slightest, and it wasn't welcome at the time. I suddenly had a realization that my whole understanding up to that point in my life, at that point we're looking at around 76 years, was totally wrong. It was absolutely wrong. There is no external physical reality out there. Everything is connected, and it's all coming within, not from without. In that realization, that in a sense that's a world of illusion, what they refer to in as Maya in the Indian tradition, subcontinent India. I realized that it's not just that the physical environment is illusion, like even the notion that there's other people there in my life or in my presence physically, all that's illusion. And that was very scary. It was a sense of like, oh my gosh, like I'm all alone in this universe. And fortunately, it flipped very quickly into a wider realization. I'm not alone. I'm connected to everyone and everything. And it totally changed. And with that point, as I said, once I understood, I had no choice but to take it on as a mission in this world of extreme divisiveness and peril. I had to teach, I had to speak out, and I do it in whatever way I can these days.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. We have such rich experiences. It's transformative. And I think I harp on this a lot, and I don't go into a whole lot of detail in this podcast. But the way we see the world, to see the world as purely materialistic is an assumption, and it's a bad one at this point. And to deny all of these experiences that people have, like parapsychological experiences, but to try to confine them, to do research on them and restrict it to a materialistic and frame it within a materialistic view of the world. The problem is not the phenomena itself.
Yes.
It does happen. Are there fakers out there? Absolutely. And that's fakers in everything.
Yes.
But you have to be, in order to understand this, you have to have a much broader foundational assumption about the nature of reality in order to do the proper type of research that's necessary to capture these experiences that are real. So I think that that's a conversation that you and I can have at another time, which I would love. We're coming to a close now. I just wanted to focus on your take on what living well is, or what the good life means to you in this conversation. It would be awesome to have you come back, and I would love to just sit here and just explore, quote unquote, metaphysics, and explore some of the things that was touched on, even like placebo, which is a subject I would love to get into, because I will just say this, the fact that we live in a very strange world where, people in certain situations, placebo can be as high as 30%. And we're not exploring it. You know that this thing exists, and we're so afraid to explore it. Not we all, I'm not, but a lot of people in our society and scientists are so afraid to explore it because it will quote unquote destroy their assumptions about the world, and you can't assume exactly. It won't work for them. But that's a subject that I think I would love to speak with you about in a different context, because I think there's a lot there that is unfortunately not being explored because of people's dogmatic viewpoints and refuse to explore it. And then, and unfortunately, since a lot of people refuse to explore it for various, the whole scientific community is weird. There's lots of issues there we can definitely not get into there. But what happens is you get charlatans that come in and take advantage of and manipulate people in the wellness world. It's not all bad, but they're all there. I've been in that world. There are lots of people in that world that are charlatans. That's true. But that's true that there are charlatans in the scientific community too. So, they're everywhere. And so I think that there's so many things that you touched on that we can explore, and hopefully we can get to do that at another time. But before we end, I want to ask you, are there any final thoughts that you would like to leave for the audience? Anything that you would like to leave? I know, right? I know.
Well, okay. So one, I would just come back to your question. Aside from people having forgotten the truer nature of our reality, aside from the existential threats we're having right now, in a very fundamental level, many people have lost the capacity to even think. for various reasons. One is just information overload, overwhelm, just too much, they can't process it. It's beyond their bandwidth. For some, it's because they are following the wrong feeds on social media and feeding conspiracy thinking, but they're not able to think for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And for some, because they just blindly are believing with faith that someone who says they have their best interests at heart as their leader really is doing it because they have their best interests at heart, just assuming it. And we have to come out of our state of denial that things are okay or will work out okay. Life is not like that. We have to wake up. We have to start thinking, reflecting, and connecting.
Thank you.
You're
Love
welcome.
it.
Thank you.
This has been great. Thank you for sharing that. And there's just so much I want to talk to you about, but I think that I would love to, we'll put a pin in it, and we'll hopefully come back to have a conversation at another time
Thank you.
to dig deeper into some of these subjects that I think is super important, that are super important for us to explore. That's going to help us leave a more meaningful, good life. So thank you, Howard. This has been great. I appreciate you, and looking forward to many more conversations in the future.
Thank you, Roderick. Be well.
Thank you so much for tuning into the show. I hope this conversation has inspired you to reflect on your own views of the good life. If you enjoyed the show and want to hear more inspiring and thought-provoking conversations, please follow, write a review, and rate us on your favorite podcast app. If you are tuning in on YouTube, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support is very much appreciated.